Salve everybody, welcome to our NeoPsychology course. I'm Lord Salvator and today we'll be diving into shame and modesty. Quick word beforehand. There will be mentions of religious stories as well as topics that may be seen as true or false. I'm not here to prove or disprove these stories, but simply to explore the psychology of these stories. This course mentions these beliefs as beliefs, looking from both the perspective of believers and non-believers. So without further ado, let's start with one of the most famous stories of shame. In the Christian Bible, Genesis 3:6 to 3:21, Adam and Eve, the first woman and man, had sinned. This sin opened their eyes for them to be aware that they were naked. Shame quickly set in as they created clothes out of fig leaves. The most interesting part about the story is the way it talks about the awareness that they were naked. As if beforehand they weren't aware. This does create an interesting conversation about the relation between modesty and awareness. If one is not aware, one does not feel shame. But why would this cause shame upon them? Adam and Eve were husband and wife. Well, because according to this story, shame wasn't about someone else, but yourself. You are ashamed. Somebody else isn't ashamed for you. I mean, they can be ashamed of you, but certainly not for you. Doing something shameful means you have to hide it, which could be what the fig leaves represent. Fig leaves do have a slightly phallic outline, which could be why it was picked. But in the end, it's not about the leaf, but what it is used for. To hide something that is a part of you. In a way, shame is about consequence, which can also be related to fear. Now we'll dive into fear a bit more in depth in the next episode of this course, but to put it simply, people fear rejection, people fear loss, people fear becoming a pariah. So when it comes to nudity, beauty standards seem the largest reason for this development. And I'm not just talking about how pretty someone is, but rather the aesthetic tribalism. Rejection and pariahization is common in the tribal mindset of primates as well as humanity, having to fight for resources and territory. Someone from a different ethnic group is therefore always going to be seen as a natural enemy. But if that's the case, why aren't we all racist? Well, because we are aware. Tribal mindset is no longer viable when globalization is taking hold. So what about shame is so viable still? Because aside from nudity, other types of shame exist too. Shame after failure is the most common. And this leads to one conclusion. Shame is disappointment of the self. When you are disappointed by yourself, either your physical appearance or a mistake you made, that's when the word shame comes into play. Now that's a very heavy statement, so I'm going to back it up with data. And the best way to do that is by interviewing some people. Now, if you want to skip the interviews, there will be a marker in the description to skip past the interviews. What experience in your life made you feel the most shame?
When people accidentally saw my bra as a child.
And why did you feel shame?
Because it was in front of the boy I liked and I didn't want him to see me like that.
I see. So, I have this theory that talks about the beauty standards of the modern world having been the largest reason for the development of shameful thoughts about nudity, which is about the aesthetic tribalism, which is the idea that basically, in one sentence, shame is a disappointment of the self. Whereas you are disappointed with something about yourself, whether it's your body or something you've done, shame is disappointment. What do you think about that?
I guess.
And it also goes back to fear of rejection and fear of losing people and fear of loss, fear of becoming a pariah, basically.
Yeah.
And that's been my working theory, which I think kind of is where I think especially the pariah part, the rejection part, is really where I see a lot of people are hammering it down. But thank you for answering these questions. Very helpful. So, what experience in your life made you feel the most shame?
The most shame.
Yes.
Oh boy, I probably have to think about it for a while.
That's okay.
I guess it might be really dumb, but the thing that gives me the most shame is probably, imagine like there's I'm having a discussion with somebody,
Yeah.
and in my opinion, this is my view on that, on a point or something, and the person that I'm discussing with has another point of view on that same topic,
All right.
and we argue so much that at some point we start to just look it up and see like who's right and stuff like that. And whenever I am wrong, that makes me feel ashamed because I'm like, I was discussing so hard about something that I thought was right, but eventually it was wrong. So I feel quite like
So,
ashamed
but why did you feel shame?
because I had to admit my opponent was right.
And why does that make you feel shame?
I don't know. It's just a feeling.
Because you basically felt like you lost a battle. Is that what it is?
Oh, maybe, yeah.
So,
Could be.
okay, so this is what I think, right? So, uh, I go by this idea that shame is disappointment of the self,
Hmm.
which basically goes by the idea that people fear rejection, people fear loss, and they fear becoming a pariah, which goes back to the aesthetic tribalism, for example, that in nudity, for example, it's the aesthetic tribalism, but then there's other types of tribalism, which basically goes to the back to the primates, which is about territories and resources and wanting to protect your own family against a different horde, basically, and which also where racism originates from, But my idea was here that shame is viable in that sense, um, but why was the question. But in order to figure that out, I thought that we needed to first, develop an idea of what shame really is. And I really do think that shame is disappointment of the self. Would you say that your shame could be described in that moment as being disappointed in yourself?
Yeah,
All
definitely.
right. Thank you for the answer. Thank you for answering my questions.
No problem.
What experience made you feel the most shame?
Well, honestly, it was mainly a friend of mine. Well, a friend of mine found out I am into a certain kind of hentai, and this hentai was about one of his favorite video game characters of all time. And the thing is that this friend of mine found out, and I considered him at the time to be a really good friend. And I was just embarrassed that word actually got out what I had been searching.
But what was the consequence you were so afraid of?
Well, the consequence I was so afraid of was that he wouldn't be able to look at me the same way, or that he might kind of kink shame me.
So this is the idea that I had, which was that shame, in one sentence, shame is disappointment of the self. In a sense, it's when you have an attribute to yourself that you're not proud of, and you don't want to share that with anyone. So you think that this might be
Yeah.
wrong, and I think that one of the reasons why is I captured back to the aesthetic tribalism, for example, with nudity. For example, why are people afraid
Hmm.
of being naked? And I said in my report, and also what I'm saying in this course currently, is that aesthetic tribalism comes from the fear and rejection and pariahization, which is basically the tribal mindset of primates, which is that they had to fight for resources and territory, and therefore they were very violent against other ethnic groups, so to speak, other gangs of primates. So
Yeah.
to become a pariah in there and the rejection of your own family, own group, I think that might have been one of the reason why you might feel shame. Shame, like I said, is disappointment of the self. It's where you feel like you have failed at fitting in with, for example, the paradigm, which is you can't like certain types of sexualization, which is the paradigm. It's the stigma that is surrounding that particular part. I don't know what you think about
Yeah.
that. What do you think about that?
Well, honestly, at the time, I felt absolutely embarrassed. At that time, I just wanted it to end. I wanted to be anywhere but there.
So you wanted to slip into almost escapism, basically, because you you were so. I guess you were afraid. Were you afraid? Is that something that can be said?
Yeah.
You were afraid of. Were you afraid of the consequences, or
I was afraid of my friend's judgment.
so you were afraid of being judged? So you were afraid that like he was gonna reject you, basically.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, thank you for answering these questions.
Not a problem.
Now, that may not have seemed like a lot of interviewees, but that's 3 people who all practically say the same thing. Now, I would grab a larger portion if I had more people available, but I sadly don't. But still, it can't be denied that one reoccurring theme so far has been rejection of the group. Well, how does one counter it then? How do you counter shame? How do you stay modest? And how do you counter shame? Well, first of all, you realize that shame is putting up standards for yourself and then failing at those. So, if you don't like the standards you have for yourself, then maybe you should change them. Let's say that I have to do some work. I'm trying to do a project and I fail. I could be ashamed of failure. But if I'm ashamed of my failure, I'm neglecting the idea that I've learned something from that failure that could make me win in the future. And nobody wins the first time when it comes to the most difficult things. Because you have to learn, you have to adapt, you have to train things. So, using that logic, you can say, okay, I don't have to be ashamed of failure. Explain it away. Which is interesting, because according to the story of Adam and Eve, awareness was the thing that caused shame to be there to begin with. But when you work on it, that's when it becomes better. It's like when you cleanse the sins you have rather than to ignore them. And yes, you pay your penance for it. You leave the Garden of Eden, your safe space. But it's better psychologically for you to for your growth to take that shame and learn to convert it into something that you can use in the future. Whether that's a lesson, confidence, or new rules.